All right.
You don't get to see it.
Well, yes, but then we can deny it later. But if it's online, when Andy runs for president 20 years from now, someone will bring it up.
I'm not sure that's what we need.
Well, let's not even go there yet. Okay, I'll back that up a bit. And let's see here.
Working now.
Yes, it is. Or at least it should be. I'll get confirmation on that in about 5 minutes. There's like a 20 to 30-second lag between what we do and what shows up on the Magic,
Okay.
on the Magic computer.
Yep.
Oh, Sam says that it's working.
Good.
Okay, hang on. Okay. Can you hear me at least, Sam? If I talk into this microphone. Great. Okay. So Andy, it is 2 o'clock. What is your will? Would you like to get started, or would you?
It's entirely up to you.
Okay, well, I think we've got a good crowd. I don't see anybody coming up. I mean, they've been quiet now for a while.
Yeah.
I think they're ready. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, great. Sam, we're gonna go. And live stream, we're gonna go. All right. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. It's 2 o'clock. We're going to be efficient and start on time. So hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Julia Osman. I'm the director of the Institute for the Humanities. I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's program on American exceptionalism and the Civil War to today. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the many people involved in bringing about this event. So this looks simple. This is not simple. So first, I'd like to thank the College of Arts and Sciences for supporting this program, including Karen Brown, Kelly Anthony, and Sarah Nichols, who see to the publicity, and also Sam Kielhofer, who is running the live stream. Thank you, Sam. I'd like to thank the Grant Library for hosting us, especially Hannah and Linda, who helped arrange the space. So we're very fortunate to hold the event in this beautiful museum, and I hope you will all, inspired by a conversation with Dr. Lang, take some time to see the exhibits at the conclusion of the program. I'd also like to thank James Herzog from the MSU bookstore for arranging the book sales. And finally, last and definitely not least, I would like to thank James Mize and Josh Tucker and an undergraduate named Mac, who are running the technology. Upon them, everything we do depends. So let's give them a round of applause, all the people who helped do this. So thank you. And now I'd like to introduce the star of the show, Dr. Andrew F. Lang. Dr. Lang got his PhD from Rice University in 2013, and he is currently an associate professor here at Mississippi State, as I think many of you know, as you've probably been in his classes. His first book, In the Wake of War, Military Occupation, Emancipation, and Civil War America, won the prestigious Tom Watson Brown Book Award in 2018. And now you all need to go, oh, yes, because that is an award given by the Society of Civil War Historians for the best book on the Civil War era. And if you haven't read it yet, you are in luck because we are selling it after the program. But it is his second book, A Contest of Civilizations, Exposing the Crisis of American Exceptionalism in the Civil War Era, which, by the way, was a finalist for the Gilder Lerman Lincoln Prize, which is, everyone go, oh, another prestigious prize for the best book on Civil War history that we are talking about today. And yes, this book is also for sale after the program, so I hope you brought your credit cards. I'm just going to give you a little summary of this book just to whet your appetites and just kind of orient us all into the conversation. So, A Contest, oops, let's hold it right here. A Contest of Civilizations is an intellectual and political history of American exceptionalism. In the opening chapters, Dr. Lang shows how in the 18th and 19th centuries, the United States distinguished itself from aristocratic Europe as a functioning democracy. Even after multiple revolutions, European countries only cycled back to aristocratic-based governments. America at this time, therefore, was quite exceptional. Yet slavery disrupted that concept in the United States. Dr. Lang spends most of the book, it's a good bit of the book, showing the cognitive dissonance of a country conceived in liberty, relying on men and women in bondage. However, he argues that the Union victory at the end of the Civil War preserved the American Republic and therefore that exceptionalism. In addition to what American exceptionalism meant during the Civil War, Dr. Lang, by the way, is also happy to talk about how this concept of American exceptionalism helps us understand what is at stake for our republic today. So this program is a conversation with Dr. Lang. So I'm going to start off with a few questions just to get things going and allow him to address a few concerns up front. And then we'll open it up for questions and conversation. And if you are online, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. And if you, while online, have a question or would like to add a comment to the conversation, just type it in the comment section just below the video you're watching, and we'll be sure to incorporate it. And so now, without any further ado, Andy, can I ask you a question?
Yes,
Did you turn your microphone on?
I did.
Oh, great. You're doing great already. All right. So, Andy, I was wondering if you could start us off by telling me how you came to this topic, and then maybe take a minute or two and help define American exceptionalism during the Civil War and what it means for your larger book.
Well, thank you, Dr. Osmond, for helping me kick off the academic year for the Institute for Humanities. And thank you to the Grant Library for being gracious hosts, and to the College of Arts and Sciences for promoting the Institute. So how did I come to this topic? How much time do you have?
We've got about 55 minutes.
Way longer than that to tell this story.
A whole book worth, I imagine.
Shortly after getting here, one of my old mentors invited me to write on this subject for the Littlefield history of the American Civil War era at the University of North Carolina Press. Didn't think I'd be doing this for my second project, though it's a subject, a theme that is very much a part of my first book. It's a subject that I've long been interested in, but again, never thought I would do it. That's how I came to the topic. More later at happy hour. American exceptionalism. It is a phrase. It is a four-letter word in academia and higher education, which made this all the more fun to write. It is also a phrase that Americans in the 19th century did not use. It is a phrase that came about in the 20th century that was actually coined by none other than Joseph Stalin himself to ask why the United States never developed into a socialist utopia. And yet, the concept itself, which I'll define in just a moment, is ubiquitous all throughout the American Republic, and even preceding and predating the American political regime itself. It's a concept that, like Dr. Osmond said, helps Americans then and now, give them a sense of self, definition, and identity. At the time, a very benign definition of the term would be, just as Dr. Osmond said, a federal republic, and indeed the only federal republic in the entire world at the time, one predicated on natural rights, natural law, a republic not founded or based on myth or legend, but rather a republic with a written constitution, a written Declaration of Independence, the first of its kind, the declaration that is, in the world. It's a republic that's not based on throne and altar, blood or soil, religious or ethnic lineages, divine right of kings. It is different. It is the exception in the world, governed by nobles, monarchs, aristocrats, and oligarchs. Now, the word exception was indeed used by an American and a Frenchman. I'm going to come back to them in a little while, but that's what we're dealing with here. It's a group of people, 19th century Americans, who really do believe that they are separate, distinct, and on an alternate course of history in time and place. Now, that's the benign definition. There is absolutely a romantic definition that has gotten the United States in all kinds of fun messes over the 2.5 centuries of its existence. But I think that when we take it on its own terms and take it properly understood, it is a republic that quite literally stripped, and this is in the United States Constitution, stripped inherited titles, the laws of primogeniture, in favor of, at least on paper, and ideally in practice, in favor of notions of individual liberty, the idea that the individual really does matter, that the individual can be born into a station in life that is not permanent, that is not static, but that the individual, through his or her own acumen, ambition, talent, and natural rights, has the ability to advance and acquire personal sovereignty. Now, what does this have to do with the Civil War? I would say it has everything to do with the American Civil War. Insofar as everything that we've discussed right now, defining the term, setting its parameters, there comes to be an irreconcilable conflict over what all this means. All Americans subscribe to liberty. All Americans subscribe to equality, but there is a fractured consensus on what these terms mean. And I want to conclude this last question by offering a brief vignette on how this works throughout the entire book. And I want to take us to December of 1860, 1 month after Abraham Lincoln is elected in November 1860 to the presidency of the United States. Back in those days, the presidents were not sworn into office, were not inaugurated until March. So there's a 4-month gap between Lincoln's election and his inauguration in March, during which time, of course, a great political and constitutional crisis befalls the Republic. This is the moment between December and March when 7 slave-holding states of the Deep South secede from the Union and ultimately form their own nation, the Confederate States of America. Now, before this happens, in December, President-elect Lincoln receives a letter. And it's a letter from one of his old friends back in the 1840s from their days, their mutual days in Congress, back in the old days of the Whig Party. The letter that Lincoln receives is from a man by the name of Alexander Stephens. And at the time, in December 1860, Stephens, the senator from Georgia, is one of the most prominent American nationalists in the entire country. Equally so, a prominent slaveholder and defender of Southern rights. And Stephens writes to Lincoln basically asking him for guarantees, protections for what makes the United States, in Stephens' mind, exceptional. So what does Stephens ask of Lincoln? He says, now, you'll agree with me, Mr. President-elect, that back in the days of the founding, there was no organized anti-slavery political party. We all know, right, Mr. Lincoln? We all agree that anti-slavery was never intended to be written into the American fabric. Instead, what makes this country great, you'll agree with me, Mr. President-elect, is that this is a federal republic in which all states have sovereignty to practice their own domestic institutions in their own way. It is this republic that gives we, in Stephens' terms, white Americans, political equality and political liberty in a way that's never before seen in the world. And now we're in a crisis. We're in a crisis because you and your party have now been elected on an unprecedented ticket, pledging to restrict the expansion of slavery into the national territories, pledging to place slavery on the course of ultimate extinction, and reading, as Stephens said, into the Declaration of Independence, the central idea that all men are created equal. But he says this, quote, we at the South do think African slavery as it exists with us, both morally and politically right. This opinion is founded upon the inferiority of the Black race, end quote. For Stephens, this is what makes the United States exceptional, ultimately exceptional. And in some ways, he's right, insofar as the size of the United States, by far the largest slaveholding nation in the world in 1860. Stephens wants it to keep this way, or stay this way. And so he asks from Lincoln what Stephens calls a word fitly spoken. A word fitly spoken by you would now be like apples of gold in pictures of silver. Now, Stephens knows that Lincoln is a great devoted reader of the King James Bible. And he knows that Lincoln, photographic memory, has pretty much the whole Bible memorized. And he knows that Lincoln will go immediately to Proverbs 25:11, where Solomon speaks of a word fitly spoken, which means a word that is so sacred and so rooted in truth that it can only please God, be like apples of gold in pictures of silver. That's what Stephens wants from Lincoln, an assurance for the protection of what makes the United States unique, a large slaveholding republic, a word fitly spoken. Lincoln doesn't respond to Stevens. Instead, he does what he normally does throughout his public life. He goes to his office, closes the door, and sits down with a piece of scrap paper and a pen and works out a problem facing him, like a math equation. And he thinks about what Stevens is saying. What really does make the United States unique? Is it power? Is it prosperity? Is it national growth? Heck, is it even racial inferiority? Is it human bondage? Lincoln says, no, none of this is true. The Constitution and the Union itself, while good in their own right, they're not the great cause of our prosperity. There's something back of these, entwining itself more closely about the human heart. It is what Lincoln called the principle of liberty to all. Was it necessary for the United States to declare the principle of liberty for all in effecting separation from Great Britain? No, without this, we could have declared our independence, but we could not have secured our free government and our consequent prosperity. It is that principle, the equality of all men, liberty to all, that's the word fitly spoken, at least insofar as Lincoln reads it. The Declaration of Independence is thus the apple of gold, encased prominently, enduringly, around or within a picture of silver, which itself is the Constitution and the Union, the rule of law and the nation itself. The picture was made for the apple. In other words, the republic was made for liberty and natural rights. So let us act that neither the picture or the apple shall be ever blurred, bruised, or broken. Fast forward 2 months. Stevens never received his assurance from President Lincoln. The Republican Party refused to compromise with wayward secessionists. The Republican Party pledged to maintain its anti-slavery platform. And thus Stevens seceded with his home state of Georgia to build a new nation, the Confederate States of America, to which Stevens now attributed American exceptionalism. He said, our new government is based upon the exact opposite ideas of the United States and the Declaration of Independence. Its foundation rests, its cornerstone is laid, this is a quote, upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery and subordination to the superior race is his natural and moral condition. This is the first nation in the world predicated on this great physical and philosophical moral truth. 2 years later, on July 7th, 1863, 4 days after the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln receives visitors at the White House, serenading him in the wake of the great Union victory in Pennsylvania. And off the cuff, Lincoln says this: how long ago has it been? Some 80-odd years since on the 4th of July, for the first time in the history of the world, a nation by its representatives assembled and declared as a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. For the first time in the history of the world, same words that Stevens used in 1861 to describe the Confederacy. What we have is a contest. One might call a contest of civilizations on the North American continent to determine what exactly American exceptionalism is and is not. Are people born to rule and be ruled, or are people born inherently free and capable of ruling themselves? That's what's at stake in this book. I won't tell you how it ends.
I'm supposed to ask one more follow-up question on of this before I open it up, and I'm stuttering because I almost want to cry. That was so beautiful, Andy. Isn't it nice that you have sources that phrase things just so beautifully? Yes, maybe that's one of those reasons why you studied the Civil War. Okay, so it sounds to me, and is this in your book?
Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like there are a couple of different concepts of American exceptionalism going on here. Why should we care about these things now? We've titled this program American Exceptionalism from the Civil War to Today. You've given us a great idea of kind of the different definitions of American exceptionalism at stake during the Civil War. Why should we care about these definitions now?
Yeah, I'm gonna go on record right now. I'm glad this is being recorded so that we can use it later. I do not believe, nor do I expect, nor am I advocating in any way that the United States is on the verge of civil war today. I do not think that the nation is. But that does not mean that there's also a crisis, even a moral crisis in the American conscience and even in the American psyche. And I think that that's what can help us. I think this book, these times can help us navigate what seems to be our own chaotic and disordered moment. I'll answer it like this. So this book ultimately compels us to ask, the American Civil War itself compels us to ask, what does it mean to be an American? Does it mean that the United States is based on castes, arbitrary lineages, arbitrary privilege? Or does it mean that all citizens and all people themselves are endowed with certain rights that can never come from the state, but which pre-exist our own life? Right? Do we have the right to pursue happiness as we understand it? And by happiness, I mean to pursue personal independence. Do we have claim over our own conscience, over our own souls, right? Do we have the freedom to chart our own course? A lot of students in here. Why are you in college? It's certainly not to watch Mississippi State get trounced on Saturday. As Lincoln said, there must be something back of this. Why are you here? Is it to be a college student or a graduate student in perpetuity? No. You're here largely to improve your condition, right? To rise beyond the station into which you were born. And I'm not saying that this is a guarantee to become a multi-gazillion. It's not at all what I'm saying.
No, it is not. That does not happen.
It's not going to happen. There are only a few history professors who become gazillionaires. I'm not one. That's not the point, right? You're here to maintain sovereignty over your own conscience. That's ultimately what it is. I think that the United States, because whether it was on purpose or whether it was by happenstance, words on pieces of paper mean something, and the words on pieces of paper 250 years ago, I think still mean something. This story, I think, should help us remind us of who we have been and who we hopefully will continue to be.
Okay. All right. So I'm just going to go ahead and I have many questions to ask. I told Andy if just the two of us end up having a conversation, I'd be thrilled. Usually I can hardly get in his office because you all are in there. But I'd like to open up the room to any questions. If anybody wants to ask a question of Dr. Lang on the Civil War, on his perspective of American politics right now, considering the Civil War.
To an extent, I'm not doing political commentary today.
He's not doing political commentary, but if you want to ask about stuff today or why this has meaning for us today, I think that's what I was getting at.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're allowed to ask those questions. Yeah, Morgan.
Dr. Lang, I'm curious, also somewhat selfishly, a book of this and dealing with huge questions that are filtering down into all sorts of other kinds of history. What are your sources? Like, how are you building this story? I admit I haven't cracked it yet, but get to it.
Well, thank you. This is not a book based on extensive archival research. It just can't be. This is largely what we in the profession call a synthesis. So what I did is I read as deeply and widely in the existing scholarship that I could to get an idea of what everybody prior to me has said. And then I came up with all the reasons why they're wrong. No, I wanted to accept all of their premises before I gave it my own touch on, read all this stuff, what does it all mean? And then I collected a mass of fairly accessible published primary materials from as diverse a cross-section of 19th century American life as I could devise. Yes, Stevens and Lincoln, white Southerner, white Northerner. There is extensive documentation from people who were enslaved, free people of African descent, indigenous people, women, white and black. I tried to capture as big of a representative cross-section and cross-current that I could to say this is a pretty consensual view. There are fundamentally irreconcilable readings of this, but even for people who were outside of the political system, who were oppressed, who were legally barred from participating. Take Frederick Douglass, for example, one of the great exceptionalist documents to date that I commended to everybody. You can find it online with James Earl Jones reading it out loud.
Oh,
It's Frederick Douglass's What to the Slave is the 4th of July,
Right.
July 5th, 1852 in Rochester, New York. It is tip-top abolitionist, exceptionalist rhetoric in which Douglass turns the celebratory notion of exceptionalism on its head to say only in the United States can slavery and liberty coexist. And he's saying, you're not going to find this kind of hypocrisy, this kind of undermining of human rights anywhere else. He says, America reigns without rival. But then at the end, he then turns it back on its head. And he says, the only way out of this is by looking to the founding documents itself. He calls the Constitution a glorious liberty document in which there can be found not a word of slavery. This is one of Douglass's big political, and it is a very political point that he makes. My point is, I found it fascinating that the very people who are oppressed and marginalized in this 19th century context are the very ones who are looking internally for the source of their own liberation. So.
okay. Thank you. Can I ask a follow-up question? I'm going to totally abuse my situation here as moderator person. So during the 19th century, slavery or a dependence on people in bondage in the United States was, like, as you were saying, this great. I like the word cognitive dissonance because I feel that a lot sometimes. Was kind of the great challenge to America being this wonderful, exceptional place. How does that translate to now? What would you consider to be, or what would one consider to be, the greatest challenge to, like, the great American democracy now?
I love that question, and you're going to recoil when I give the initial part of my answer.
Okay.
I'd say that the challenge is the exact same. Even though our challenge today doesn't have very much anything to do with 19th century American slavery. So what's the connection that I'm drawing?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, the problem of slavery anywhere, but particularly in a republic that is predicated, at least on paper, on the sanctity of the individual. That raises a really interesting philosophical question that one of my graduate students is going to be writing about in a few weeks. The midterm essay in my graduate course on Lincoln asked my graduate students to do this. Does the moral order make the people, or do the people make the moral order? Throughout his public life, this is the question, and really any anti-slavery advocate asked. If all people are created people, that's not relative. That's final. But what's happening in the 19th century context is that it becomes tolerant or tolerable for some people to declare that it is just and it is right to enslave another. That's moral relativism. If you can make it your interest to do anything, is that moral? Or is society governed by a higher moral code? I think that this is a question that we should always ask ourselves. I think that we should always come to terms with this. And it gets kind of radical, because now we get into matters of moral truth. Is there moral truth? Who gets to set the terms of moral truth? I have an answer to that. I'm not going to get into it. But what happens when polarization becomes so deeply rooted that even the concept of justice becomes irreconcilable? Aristotle said that civil wars occur only when there becomes irreconcilable notions of justice. Is justice itself morally neutral? This is a question that Americans had to reconcile in the 19th century, the 20th century. We're going to have to reconcile it now, and we're going to continue to reconcile it long after we're gone. And I think that that's a good thing, because we are bound, whether we like it or not, to the past and the future. That's what I think this story suggests.
Okay, so in other words, you're kind of saying that the question is, is it entirely on the individual, what the individual wants, how the individual sees, the moral arc of the universe, or is there some kind of higher moral expectation that we should be aiming for? Is that right? If I'm trying to sum up what you just said?
That's what I'm trying to say. And let's pull it out of the clouds and the philosophical into the actual.
Okay.
So a big part of the story is based on the debate between Abraham Lincoln and not a Southerner, not a slaveholder, but a fellow Northerner, Stephen A. Douglas, senator from Illinois, whose political program was opening the federal territories for people in the territories on the local level to vote whether or not they would have slavery in those territories. Okay, popular sovereignty. What's more American than simple majority democracy? We love democracy. Well, Douglas said this is democracy. Just let the people vote on this issue. Is it moral for one group of people to enslave another via democracy when those people have no consent or voice in their own enslavement? It's democracy, but it's also democracy in the service of oppression. If all people are endowed with natural rights, if all people are indeed people and not property, then that form of democracy is stripped of a moral core. Question is, how do you reconcile this? That's what I'm saying.
Okay. You had me up until the very last bit, Andy. So if I can just kind of repeat what you're saying again. So you're talking about how we are continuing to reconcile difficulties within our own democracy, depending on how we are defining our terms and
Yes,
and applying what we think we are.
I am in no way suggesting that the conditions of the 19th century are the same as now. But the questions that a free society asks, I think they're always going to be there. And so that's what we have to think about when we're thinking about the past. It's not just existing out there on its own terms. The specifics are, the people are, the particular conditions exist in the past, but the broader connections from the past to the present are very much still with us.
More questions? Yes, Catherine.
Can I ask a broader question?
Yes.
In terms of the whole process, right? So what did you find really exciting about the research that went into this book, which I think is going to be really, I'm looking forward to reading. But what did you find frustrating about that research that went into it?
I'm just.
Our students wrestle with.
Sure, great question.
I'm just going to repeat the question. So for the folks online who are starting to ask questions themselves, so we know they're there. So what was fascinating? What was also frustrating about the research process?
So what was fascinating is with a book like this, I wasn't expecting to write my second book based on primary sources, or a good number of primary sources that are really well known. There's a lot of fun to go back to just some of the standards, reread them, and get into them in a way that I never had before. And it was fun. I mean, it was fun working with the big names and the big collections that I didn't think I'd have an opportunity to do. The challenge, I wouldn't say it's a frustration, but the challenge was making sure that the people like Lincoln and Jefferson Davis and even Frederick Douglass are not the representative voices for the story. That's too easy, right? If you're going to write a book that is as synthetic and broad as possible, you've got to include as many different people at many different stratas of life as possible. That was hard to do, particularly because I did most of it from this library and my office with like I said, very little archival resource. The other thing that was frustrating had very little to do with the book itself, but the conditions in which I was writing it. I wasn't finished with my first book when I started this one. And that presented all kinds of fun challenges. If you read the acknowledgments, you'll get the sense of exhaustion and grumpiness. I think I used the word grumpiness when talking about, or I apologize to my family and the acknowledgments for being so grumpy.
You called yourself unpleasant
Yes,
in the
yeah,
acknowledgement.
which is pretty standard.
Yeah. I was across from your office during that writing process.
That's true.
You were unpleasant.
Yes. No, she's 100%.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad something so wonderful came out of it.
Yes.
Did you have a question? Yeah.
I was just gonna ask, to what extent do you think these ideas of exceptionalism shaped the way Americans like developed since the Civil War?
It's a great question.
So how has American exceptionalism affected the way that America has evolved from the Civil War to present times?
There was one of the really foundational sources I read at the very beginning of this was an essay written in 1994 by an intellectual historian named Michael Kamen, K-A-M-M-E-N. And it was at a time when the American historical profession, I think rightly so, was really starting to push back against decades worth of scholarship that had really pushed an exceptionalist narrative, like books that tried to prove that the United States was indeed exceptional. This scholarship pushing back was important. It's necessary. That's how scholarly evolution works. But this essay by Kamen was really helpful to me because I almost had the passage memorized. He said, whether or not American exceptionalism is true, accurate, verifiable, what is true and verifiable is that it gives each generation of Americans a distinct sense of self. Now, again, that has positive and negative implications. What has happened from the Civil War to the present is that very process. This is an intellectual tradition that we can trace all the way back to 1630 with John Winthrop and the Puritans, the city on a hill. Now, the way Winthrop used city on a hill and the way it's been used by every politician since is different. But the idea is there, that there's something happening in this corner of the world that is different, that's a beacon, that's an example for the world to emulate. Again, stipulate. There are all kinds of qualifications in the introduction. I am not saying yes or no to any of this. I'm just saying this is how Americans think of themselves. That's certainly one of the great stories, or one of the most important stories, I should say, of the 20th century, right? Particularly in the immediate wake of the Allied victory over Nazism, totalitarianism, fascist authoritarianism, right? So I think it has been fundamental for how we think about ourselves in the world for good and ill.
Mm-hmm. Plus, we keep making movies about the Second World War, which keep kind of reiterating that idea again and again and again. Yes. I'm going to read a question from the live stream before I turn it back to the people who are here. So there's a live stream question, and the question is, at this point in American history, I think the Civil War, morality was fairly tied to religious beliefs. In your research, how did you find religion and competing religious beliefs affecting how Americans perceived American exceptionalism?
Yeah, I mean, religion is at the absolute root of this. Doesn't really matter who you are. You can find any group of Americans, a diverse group of Americans, saying everything that I've said up to this point, and then they follow it up with, or they lead with, this is a divinely chosen nation. It is ordained by God to demonstrate to the world how to do liberty, democracy, equality, all that stuff, right? This is the new Israel. You really do get that kind of imagery, that kind of rhetoric in everything. You even get rhetoric saying that God has placed the United States on a separate historical track altogether. That the United States is traveling to the sunny uplands of history, has transcended history itself, and there's a new covenant, a human covenant with God taking place right here. Now, you can see when you have a popular cultural belief like this, where you can take that. You can take it to some really dark places. This is the idea that is behind Manifest Destiny. It's the idea behind indigenous movement and relocation. It's even the idea behind slavery. Slavery becomes ordained by God. Slavery becomes a holy institution that only God in his own time can tamper with. Do we think we're as good as God? Then you can't tamper with slavery, particularly if this space, this land, this terrestrial grouping is covenanted, right? What's fascinating about this is that there is a dissenting voice. There's lots of dissenting voices, but one in particular, and it's the most famous American of the era, it's Lincoln. Never believed that the United States was divinely ordained, chosen. He says on his way to Washington, to the inauguration, that the United States is God's almost chosen people.
Mm.
And he's right. He's like, we're about to start killing ourselves. There is no chosenness here. And the whole point of Lincoln's learning about what this is during the Civil War, Lincoln comes to the opposite perspective of most of his fellow citizens. He believes that hardly than being divinely ordained, the United States is being uniquely punished in an old school or an Old Testament Jeremiah sort of way. That the United States occupies this little corner of the continent, right? Think of the first line of the Gettysburg Address. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, just a tiny little space, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, right? It's a very religiously imbued first sentence. I won't get into all the religious allusions. But the way Lincoln is thinking about it is that this people, Americans, have carved out this space, and they are saying that all men, all humans, when I say men, I mean humans, all humans are created equal. Well, if all humans are created equal, they have to be created in the image of something. Lincoln would say they're created in the image of God. If that's true, how can you then justify enslaving God's creatures? The whole point of Lincoln's second inaugural address is an Old Testament sermon explaining the punishment, the just due punishment that God has brought upon Americans. That's the extent to which, that's a level to which religion figures in this book.
Wow. Okay, so I see now, listening to you talk about this now, Andy, it makes me feel like we all need to be religion and philosophy majors if we want to be good American citizens. And I invited the philosophy department. Is anybody here from the philosophy department? They're probably all debating with themselves online, I am sure. But I reached out and told them that they would probably want to make this. I think I saw another question in the crowd. Yeah.
So I'll change.
Oh, we can follow up.
Works as your only book. Talk a little bit about another source, because Lincoln is popping up.
He does, yeah.
Another source by somebody who
Sure.
that seems to get to some of the.
Yeah,
So
perfect.
what's
perfect
another
question.
source other than Lincoln?
I keep bringing up Lincoln because I'm writing on Lincoln right now, and he's in my mind. Yeah, right. Well, I'm going to give you a cynical answer, then I'll give you the real answer. Another good person who keeps popping up is Ulysses S. Grant in this story. Just go next door. Let's take a woman by the name of Charlotte Forten. Charlotte Forten is a woman of color, born free in Massachusetts. And Charlotte Forten left just a remarkable diary that's accessible on Google Books. It's published, it's in the library, it's in our library downstairs. She has these wonderful passages, especially during the 1850s, in the wake of the Fugitive Slave Law passed by Congress in 1850, that gave the federal government plenary authority to help slaveholders track down absconded fugitives who'd been living in the North maybe for 20 or 25 years. They'd been living free for a generation. And the law allowed the government to bring free people back to bondage, in some cases just outright kidnapping.
Mm-hmm.
And Charlotte Forten has these beautiful passages where she's saying that there is no space in this entire country that is fit or safe for people of color to live. And she's saying, I hear all of my fellow abolitionist citizens, fellow citizens in Massachusetts, praising themselves for how glorious the nation is. She's like, look around. You're complicit in this. Everybody's complicit in this. What makes the nation unique is that there's no escape from what makes the nation oppressive. And she's a prominent activist. She's not just writing a diary in private. She's very much a public figure. But what about the common soldiers who served in the United States and Confederate armies? These are average citizens. The names are escaping me, but I mean, there's thousands of whose writings have existed or survived. We've got dozens and dozens and dozens of copies of diaries and letters downstairs that have been published, I'm sure on this floor in our archives here. These are citizens who are merchants, farmers, shopkeepers, but they're also incredibly politically attuned to the moment of their time. They are writing in the exact same way that political leaders, statesmen, intellectuals are writing. They understand the stakes on both sides. They understand the stakes of what is happening. The level of awareness, the level of erudition is quite unique. I think up to 90% of the United States is literate in the mid-19th century. I think that number exceeds only Sweden at the time. And these guys understand it. So I quote from them just because they're telling the story themselves. There's more. I can't think of them now.
That was pretty good though, to pull right out of your hat on the spot. I appreciate that. Also, I feel like you just kind of gave us a really nice way to encapsulate a little bit the relationship between the conversations that were going on during the Civil War and the conversations that we're having in the United States today, which is, what are we willing to be complicit in?
Well, there are more enslaved people across the world today than were trafficked in the 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade. I will not call out anybody in this room for being complicit in this. I will call out myself. I've got an iPhone in this briefcase. Let's just deal with that. Is that made by unfree labor? Yeah. What about the horrors of human trafficking, sex slavery, et cetera, et cetera? What are we willing to be complicit in? And then the next question is, well, what do we do about it? If I had the answers, I wouldn't be sitting here. I don't have the answers. What are we more complicit in closer to home? Geez, I don't know. I'm sure there's a lot that I'm not thinking of. Actually, you know what? I do have a good answer. What about the level of historical literacy? Are we willing to be complicit in that? This is not unique to our time. There are polls taken in the 1940s that are pretty similar to the polls today on historical literacy. Does that matter though? I think it does. There's generations of historical literacy. One of the things, I got to go back to Lincoln, but one of the things Lincoln said as a 23-year-old, when he first ran for political office, that there's a burden on free citizens, on a free society, to learn as he says, learn the history of one's own country and other countries, so that we may value the blessings of our free institutions. And there's a lot wrapped up in it. One of the things that we're complicit in is the complicity that's bred by prosperity. Right? We're very comfortable. I'll again speak for myself. I'm comfortable enough. I have the ability to be complacent. I'm not sure that that's entirely healthy for free society. We'll leave it at that.
Yeah. I've got a whole world civilization lecture on that. Aiden's had to sit through it before, but I won't add too much of that here. We've got a few minutes left, but I'd like to, I've got one more question I'd really like to throw at you, but before I do, I want to give someone else the opportunity to hop in, if you'd like. Anne, go ahead.
I was just gonna ask. Talk a lot about it makes sense of it.
So the question is on Lincoln and his own relationship to slavery.
Yeah,
Can you
yeah.
talk about that?
Did you get the question?
I gave a little tiny summary in the.
I'm really glad you brought up that question. It is essential to understand this period, and it's also incredibly difficult for we in the 21st century to wrap our minds around it. So if he were here today, here's how he would explain it. Again, I'm not saying we have to agree with it. Here's his argument. His argument is that at the American founding, both in 1776 with the Declaration and the Constitution of 1787, he said there was put into motion a process. Maybe it was unintentional, but at least on paper, there's a process by which abolition takes place. In other words, he rejected Stephen Douglas's argument that the United States was born to be half slave and half free and would remain so in perpetuity. Lincoln would say, where did abolition movements in the earliest days take place? They took place on the local level. Slavery is a creature of local and state law. It has constitutional protection, but Lincoln would say it doesn't have constitutional sanction. The distinction is important because Lincoln would say, like anything else in the federal system, in a system of federalism, there's a limit to what the federal government can do. But what the federal government can do is encourage actors on the state level to abolish slavery themselves in the vein that slavery was abolished in the northern states between 1777 and 1804. Lincoln would say, why is this happening? He would say it's the first time in modern history, in 2 millennia, where the concept of property and man becomes questioned, becomes contested. Governments do not have an obligation to protect human property. And what is it that gives protection for these local abolition movements? He would say the constitutional order, the federal system. If slavery is not abolished on the local level, where is it going to be abolished? It's not going to be abolished anywhere, and the United States will be a uniform slaveholding republic. So this is fine so far as it goes, but what about the 1850s, right? There's no way gradual emancipation is going to happen. The reason he says this is because, one, we've begun to look at the Declaration of Independence and call it glittering generalities and self-evident lies. You have people looking at it and saying all humans are not created equal. Some were born to be booted and spurred, others were born to rule. You have people like Stephen Douglas who equivocate on the issue. When you condition a society to become ambivalent to this, nobody's going to act against it. So Lincoln's whole political philosophy is rooted in what I think is a really important point, that the notion of freedom, the notion of human rights, is the flip side of the coin to political equality. Do slaveholders have political equality in the federal system? Yeah, unfortunately they do. The minute the federal government abridges the political equality of any citizen, then the constitutional order and ordered liberty becomes moot. Thus, what has to happen is through persuasion, changing of perspective, really hard work of politics. It could take 200 years. Is that just? Not in our sense of moral justice. Is it just in the political legal sense of justice? We don't have to agree with it. Lincoln would say it is. The Declaration and the Constitution, he would say, have to work together. And the whole system is supposed to be slow and plodding. The only thing that accelerated it is the most massive war in American history. It's largely an unsatisfying answer, but that's the answer that he would give.
Okay. Thanks for the question, Anne. Any last questions? Yeah, Chris, go ahead.
Well, you already answered one of them, but I wanted to just kind of, you mentioned early on, near the beginning, twice, you identified the Confederates as a nation. That seems to be a very pointed word to me.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
the Confederacy really a nation?
I'm glad you brought this up because this allows me to talk briefly about the method of the book. I wrote this book as best I could through the perspective of all the people whom I'm writing about. If Confederates said that they created a nation, I explain what that means, and I take them on their own terms to explain what does it mean to create a nation, how does that function, what does it look like? Now, I do not think, personally, my reading of history, my reading of the law, I do not believe that the Confederacy was, in fact, an independent nation. What I do believe is that people at the time thought that they were members of an independent nation. And thus I treat those convictions seriously so that I can then try to interpret their words and their actions. One of the interesting paradoxical things about this, the United States government, of course, never recognized the Confederacy as a de jure nation, but they did recognize the Confederacy as a de facto nation. Why? How? Technically speaking, in a civil war, in a rebellion, in an insurrection, what legal authority would the United States have in confronting Confederate soldiers? Technically speaking, they could execute in mass numbers soldiers and civilians who are in rebellion. But is that the prudent thing to do? If you're waging a war for reunion, is it prudent to kill half the population? You lose your standing on the world stage when you exceed the justness of war, right? For those wondering, there's a huge legalistic section on the book on this. Really important question that Chris asks.
It's a fascinating legalistic section, though. I'm just going to end with my last question, and it's the question that you knew that was coming to you. All right.
It's a good.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm not a Civil War historian by nature. I have to say I've actually enjoyed talking to you about this, Andy. But so here's kind of the learning question that I had after reading your book. So you present a rather glass half full view of Reconstruction in your book as something that, while very imperfect, succeeded at keeping the Union together, and thus in the places where Reconstruction kind of failed, so long as the Union together, you see it as a success. And so my question is, could you really have a country conceived in liberty? Could it really have kind of been exited from the Civil War, and could it really have a successful Reconstruction if the women and the people of color did not have or were not allowed to exercise their rights?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it takes a lot for me to write and speak in any terms of glass half full. That's not my disposition.
No.
It might come off as glass half full because that's how I read the primary sources. What do I mean by that? If you look at what it is the majority of white loyal citizens were trying to do during Reconstruction, there's one overriding purpose, two overriding purposes. One, ensure that the nation does not fracture again into civil war, which is the absolute standard condition for any nation or any society coming out of a civil war. There's never just one civil conflict. They build on top of each other. They deteriorate a civil society until there is no more law or civil order left. In their place, a strong man rises, a dictator rises, and it's all over. Read the first 12 Federalist Papers. That's what they're about. How do we prevent that from happening? Well, to answer that first question, the second question is eliminate in every respect the cause of the war and the vestiges of that cause. Emancipation eliminates the cause of the war. Now, how do we eliminate any of the remaining embers of slavery? The 14th and 15th Amendments, or back before that, the Civil Rights of 1866, the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, the 14th Amendment of 1868, 15th Amendment of 1870, they are not inevitable outgrowths of Union victory and emancipation. They're contingent, based on the fact that Confederates after the war were unrepentant and attempted to rebuild the very society that had collapsed by 1865. So what do we do? Out of a sense of moral justice, at least according to some of its architects, and a sense of political justice, the Republican Party did what? Unlike any other post-emancipation society anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, this did not happen in the British West Indies, French West Indies, Dutch West Indies, It will not happen in Brazil later in the 1880s. It will not happen in Cuba. The United States enfranchised and bestowed universal civil equality upon the post-emancipated class in record time. This did not happen anywhere else. Why? Two reasons. You can't have a society predicated on individual liberty and a class of citizens that's kind of free. You can't have freedom without liberty. So the Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment expands the base of the Republican Party, enfranchises 2.5 million, maybe not that many, enfranchises African-American men of voting age. Why? Who are they going to vote for? Absolutely the Republican Party, the party of union and the party of emancipation. Why? To diminish the political authority of unrepentant former Confederates. What does this do? By 1870, it does, insofar as the term means reconstruction. It reconstructs the Union and builds a biracial Republican Party-based ruling class in the American South. Something like that had never existed in American history in this region. By 1870, many people could say, our work is done. Their work, from our perspective and from the perspective of freed people in the late 19th century, the work was hardly done. Black congressmen and senators make this point over and over and over and over on the floor of Congress. Black political leaders on the local, state, and national level make this point. The book ends, though, with this premise, or this question. The only way in the mid to late 19th century to enforce civil rights and true authentic justice is by using an unprecedented amount of central force, centralized government force, military force in the service of civil rights. What does that mean? Federal force to enforce civil law. The United States is either a decentralized federal republic, or it's now a central militarized state on the European scale. The question is that what we're going to have? The answer was no. The enforcement of civil rights would be traded for a decentralized republic. But think of the genius of the amendment system. Justice was long overdue. It is delayed. That is not acceptable then and now. But what happens is, because our system is written down, the 14th Amendment, it's not very ambiguous. 15th Amendment, not very ambiguous. Declaration of Independence, not very ambiguous. What happens? Same thing that's always happened. People who've been outside of the system petition for inclusion. Why? No one ever wakes up in the morning and says, you know, see that all humans are created equal? No, I don't think I am. No one does that. It's the exact opposite. Those words either mean something or they don't. I say, because I'm outside the system, I say they mean something. That's how I mean.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Hopefully this has whetted all y'all's appetite to go buy your very own copy of Contest of Civilizations, Exposing the Crisis of American Exceptionalism in the Civil War Era. Andy is going to be back there at the book signing area, signing the books that you buy, and you can ask him further questions there. But thank you very much. And Andy, thank you.
Thank you very much. I had a quote from a Frenchman ready to go, but I couldn't get to it.
Oh, you couldn't get to it, I'm sure.